This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Thank you very much, Sander, and thank you for everyone for coming and for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and privilege to have been asked by the Institute of Liberal Arts to talk with you today about the interdisciplinary future. The Institute and my home institute, the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago, are close relatives in a small family, degree-granting interdisciplinary graduate programs. And we are about the same institutional age. The committee was founded in 1941, the Institute in 1952. The committee is a great books program, and the Institute is much stronger in the social sciences than we are. We're about the same size, and at least in a normal year, admit the same number of graduate students. Obviously, we both have a great stake in, both believe in, interdisciplinary study. The question of what interdisciplinary study actually consists in, however, is a very difficult topic. Actually, the discourse about any form of education has become so encrusted with cliches and banalities that it would be understandable if the title of my talk were greeted with the same enthusiasm as the prospect of slides from my Minnesota vacation. But in the 40 years I've been teaching undergraduate and graduate students, there has never been so much discussion of American higher education as there has been in the last 5 years or so, more even than in the overheated late 60s. Then the discussion was narrower, intensely political, focused on the nature of presumed academic authority and the political relevance of university study, not the economic relevance, the political relevance. Today, the atmosphere of crisis is unmistakable. The financial model of both state and private universities appears to many unsustainable, and the discussions seem to portend great possible changes, structural changes, in the system itself. We all know the symptoms of the crisis. State funding for universities has plummeted. The University of California, where I taught for 17 years, once one of the greatest collective achievements of democratic civilization, has already priced itself out of reach of most of the kinds of students for whom it was so valuable. Most students leave college and certainly leave graduate or professional school with a crushing debt burden that will weigh them down for years. Nationwide, half of university courses are taught by adjunct faculty, who are paid miserably and have no health or retirement benefits and no job security. At some campuses, the number is 70%. We all know these numbers, but they give me pause every time I notice them. They mean that the vast American university system is essentially now running on highly educated but cynically exploited labor. The vocationalizing of American higher education seems to know no bounds, and so universities are subjected to cost-benefit analyses that are assumed to be the absolute measure of value. Since the Bayh-Dole Act allowed universities to patent and license faculty discoveries, even if funded by public funds, we have seen a corporatization of the university so extreme that the production of new knowledge as the chief goal of a research university has taken on a totally new meaning, that is, the production of profits. This new system of partnerships between universities and corporations may be the single most decisive transformation in the nearly 1,000-year history of the university. It means research results are proprietary, owned, and this will probably mean the end, eventually, of open research models and the free sharing of results. A prominent billionaire contemptuously offers hundreds of thousands of dollars to students if they will quit university and found a company, under the obvious assumption that nothing they will learn in university is worth knowing. If we ask seriously what contemporary undergraduates expect from their time in university, beyond a credential for having made it through, the topic would probably take too depressing a turn. We could see part of the answer in the gyms, the pools, the climbing walls, the student centers, and the luxurious dining halls. So the atmosphere is one of great anxiety, and administrations in many universities clearly intend to make use of such an opportunity, the opportunity provided by a financial panic and the resulting credibility of there is no alternative financial argument, to remake the organization of the university, even to rethink its purpose. And the reorganization, administratively inspired interdisciplinarity, let us say, most often has little intellectual credibility. My friends in philosophy at the University of Essex in Great Britain were told that they had to find another humanities department to partner with, any other department, as long as it would allow savings in administrative costs. They finally ended up as the Department of Philosophy and Art History. This financially fueled interdisciplinarity is all being proposed on a scale that would have surprised even Thorstein Veblen, author of the uncannily prophetic The Higher Learning in America, subtitled A Memorandum on the Conduct of Universities by Businessmen, and first published in 1918. Veblen called university presidents captains of erudition and departments bureaus of erudition. The interdisciplinary thinking behind such reorganization is clearest in what a chancellor of an Australian university is reported to have said. Quote, undergraduates are income, faculty are expense. We should increase the former and decrease the latter. Now, admittedly, partly what is happening is something like a boom and bust cycle in higher education. The great post-World War II expansion of tertiary education came to a rather sudden, unexpected, and bracing halt in the early 1970s. Alas, I remember it well, just when I was first entering the job market. And the accumulated results of that long retrenchment have been brought into extremely sharp focus by the Great Recession of 2008. But from the early 70s on, colleges began closing rather than opening, and yet graduate schools began overproducing PhDs in many disciplines, especially the humanities. There was no market correction for this. Professors still needed graduate students in their seminars and cheap labor to teach and mark papers by undergraduates. And the so-called culture wars then erupted in the 80s, challenging the canon of core curricula and further destabilizing the self-understanding of the traditional university. By contrast, in the golden age between 1945 and 1975, the number of undergraduates in the United States increased 500%. The number of graduate students increased 900%. More professors were hired in the 1960s alone than had been hired in the 325-year history of American higher education until that period. Between 1956 and 1972, new community colleges were opening at the rate of one a week. We will never see such a period again, and we have clearly entered an understandable bust cycle that none of us who came up through the ranks in the Golden Age could imagine would be so deep or with such potentially profound implications. It is in this context that there is also, we hear, an intellectual crisis in the disciplinary organization of knowledge, or at least we hear a crisis in some of the humanities disciplines and a few of the social sciences. The crisis takes a number of forms. Fewer and fewer students seem to want to study the objects defined by the traditional disciplines. And on a customer model, why offer courses in medieval theories of logic or 18th century German literature if only 2 or 3 students, if that, show up? Some blame so-called grand theory in the humanistic disciplines for successfully delegitimating the discipline's claim for academic authority. Death by suicide, in other words. The sheer rapidity of shifts in intellectual fashion has created in the minds of many a skepticism about traditional disciplinary organization. As Marjorie Sabin summarizes the well-known dizzying series, quote, the main phases of the sequence have become excessively familiar. Radical social protest in the late 1960s, deconstruction in the 1970s, ethnic, feminist, and Marxist cultural studies in the 1980s, postmodern sexuality in the 1990s, and rampant careerism from beginning to end. Some claim that the organization of literature by national language or art history by historical periods have all simply become out of date and need to be rethought. The assumption is that they were not thought through very well at their inception, and that is no doubt true. In the scientific disciplines, on the other hand, the new permeability of disciplinary boundaries is mostly just celebrated. No one is objecting. Projects like AIDS research, energy science, and nanotechnology called for new forms of collaboration in ways that are quite reasonable and eagerly embraced. Even as Chicago, long known for being an academic old fogey, we too want integrative science and can even manage to allow a form of engineering into the tent if we get to call it device science. And everywhere we hear that the solution for these various crises and doubts is interdisciplinarity. This is a label that has come to mean a number of different things to different constituencies. I will exclude that form of interdisciplinarity based on a desire to fire secretaries and eliminate faculty positions as unworthy of any serious response, since it's obviously not inspired by any serious academic principle. And I would like to explore some of these issues surrounding disciplinarity and suggest several concerns. The chief concern is that the greatest threat to interdisciplinary study is the new enthusiasm for what is called interdisciplinary study. First, some comments on the general problem. The disciplines as we know them in the modern research university emerged essentially between 1870 and 1915 and were the result of a number of different factors. That is, the disciplines are not natural kinds. They are historical creations, much more like opera and tennis than they are human practices such as politics or perhaps, sadly, war. Their emergence was connected with a concomitant need for the professionalization of differing claims to knowledge. In the United States, this professionalization was partly required by a culture of democratic egalitarianism. You could not and should not inherit the privilege of speaking with academic authority. You had to earn that right, and in principle, anybody could. This meant that the disciplines had to be self-regulating professions with the authority to credential or refuse to credential whomever it wished, according to whatever publicly stated criteria the experts in the profession decreed were relevant. The greater and greater complexity of advances in human knowledge meant that a rational division of labor in such disciplines was also necessary, and the chief model here was natural science. An important problem could be broken down into parts, sometimes very small parts, and in a culture of widely shared open research, advances in the parts eventually meant advances in understanding the core or overarching issues. Someone working his whole life on the bioluminescence of one particular fish might actually end up contributing to a new drug in cancer therapy. The applicability of this model of specialization for the non-sciences is an issue we should express some skepticism about. Hyper-specialization in the humanities often comes to be an end in itself with no integrative moment or overarching project. There are philosophy departments that I could name where two specialists in epistemology do not share enough common interest to converse profitably. A lot of this is the result of a 40-year-old job and financial crisis mentioned before, which has clearly altered the way research is conducted, especially among anxious younger professors. Both longer and broader projects can come to seem to be an impossible luxury when the pressure is on to be on the cutting edge of some field and to produce publications as quickly as possible when all that builds to an irresistible level. Now, for some, the mere historicity of the current system of organization is already a sign of its deep arbitrariness, a sign that such an organization especially presumes a form of authority that cannot be defended and is likely tied not only to the self-interest of a professionally privileged class, but the interests of the powerful social groups that support the university. Such a charge is not usually made, of course, about quantum mechanics or biochemistry, although for some, the mantra, historicize everything, knows no limits, but about fields like English or philosophy or history. For Foucault, whose influence on these discussions for the past 30 years is hard to exaggerate, quote, a discipline is a principle of control for the production of discourse, unquote. That is, it is essentially a form of discipline and little more, a self-perpetuating means of excluding any threat to it. Well, if that were strictly true, as my colleague David Welbury has pointed out, it would be hard to figure out how and why disciplines, from classics to physics, could undergo such profound revolutions periodically. The only explanation would be that the disciplinary police were lousy police. But if they were that lousy, then we could not say that the discipline exists only by being policed. However, as Louis Menand has pointed out, if we start out at a very abstract level, the basic organization of the research university does not look absolutely chaotic or arbitrary, and it invites a philosophical reflection about the core issues in the debate about disciplines. The basic organization of the modern research university suggests a commitment to three basic enterprises. There are some organized attempts at knowledge that try to figure out what things there are and why what happens, happens. This is often further divided into the study of non-living things and living things. Then there are enterprises that focus on human behavior and try to understand why people behave as they do, both individually and in groups. And there are some organized attempts to figure out how things mean. Marks on a page, noises, paintings, music, manage to mean what they mean, and how we understand such meanings. Of special interest, especially for philosophers and more traditional literary critics and art historians, is the meaning and status of value claims. These enterprises are possible because of differing norms of success in each area. And of course there is overlap, especially in the sciences of human behavior, which needs to understand both why people think it's right or wrong to do something, or what it is in their self-interest to do, and what might be causally responsible for them thinking what they do. In addition, there's been a lot of discussion about importing social science methodology into the sciences of meaning, game theory, say, or even the value of neuroscience in answering questions about meaning. Perhaps it's not too early in our account to say, we will finally have true interdisciplinarity when someone at a neuroscience convention gets up and points to something he learned about the dynamics of jealousy and self-doubt from Proust that altered the way he conducts neuroscience. I won't hold my breath. It is the status of these norms that comprises the deepest and most important issue at stake in discussions of disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. This way of thinking about the problem, this tripart separation, already reflects the origin of our university system in the German model of the early 19th century and the influence on that model by the thought of Immanuel Kant. For Kant was the first to lay out a rationale for claiming that the enterprise of human Wissenschaft, or science, the organized attempt to know what we need to know to understand ourselves and the world around us, must include such different components, and most importantly, that even though they were incommensurable with each other, they were nevertheless all legitimate and indispensable. Kant's structure was different, and he was hesitant about what he wanted to call knowledge, but his structure corresponded roughly to the enterprise of natural science and causal explanation, morality and intentional explanation, and what we need from this is only the insistence that human behavior would not be properly understood if understood on the same model as cell division or iron oxidizing. Kant's covering term for the difference was freedom. And in his reflections on the beautiful, in his third great critique, he began a kind of reflection that would be transformed by the early German romantics of the Athenaeum into the sciences of criticism. We need also hermeneutical, interpretive explanations. In this context of both financial and disciplinary crisis, let me turn to the array of options listed in my rather confusing title. By deep disciplinarity, I mean a strong, unwavering commitment to the rationale of traditional disciplinary organization and an active resistance to interdisciplinarity, or at least to any form other than marginal and occasional use of another discipline's terminology. Sometimes this is just conservative defensiveness and paranoia. Sometimes someone has been educated so narrowly in a hyper-specialized subfield that a defense of a specialized disciplinarity is a defense of his viability as an academic. But the most important considerations here, others have said, are legal and professional. For as law professor Robert Post has pointed out, the authority of the disciplines is also a legal authority of some consequence. People with tenure in a department and the university administrative officers have the legal authority to terminate the appointment of someone for cause, and that cause can be their published work is no good, or even good but not good enough, no matter how much of it has been produced. This is, of course, a challengeable claim. So departments must exercise due diligence, solicit outside letters of evaluation, have given the candidate fair warning before the final decision, and not be subject to claims of bias. All of this is based on the assertion of objective expertise, and to be credible, that expertise must be limited. No one can be an expert in the humanities or the arts, and come with all the bells and whistles of academic degrees, experience, publications, prizes, named lectureships, conference invitations, and so forth. And this disciplinary specialization as legal authority sometimes operates as a greater drag on interdisciplinary experimentation than we sometimes realize. There are people, it's not completely irrational. There are people who have legitimate worries about whether we can defend the practices legally of a university if we begin to argue that disciplinary boundaries are somewhat arbitrary or porous or can be transcended. Then it'd be quite understandable if a person just denied tenure in English said, wait a minute, I believe that too. And the standards used to judge my case are subject to the same sort of skepticism that you're expressing about these disciplinary boundaries. Such a claim for disciplinary authority is also operates as a kind of drag in the defense of academic freedom. Free inquiry into the truth must be made safe from political manipulation. I'm sure everyone in the room agrees with this. But in order for that argument to be credible, the activity must actually be free inquiry into the truth, and not just the expression of a professor's personal political beliefs, especially if those beliefs are the basis of marking down student papers that do not agree with the position, or bullying and silencing alternate views in the classroom. If there is a suspicion that an entire discipline is nothing but the prosecution of a political agenda, then a claim for academic freedom loses its credibility. And it was no doubt true in the past that decisions about the canon of great literature were often political rather than scholarly, or at least more political than scholarly, that studies of history and culture neglected the contributions of minorities and women, and no doubt also true that some who righteously think of themselves as speaking truth to power, probably anybody who uses that phrase to describe himself qualifies immediately as a self-important ideological hack. But there are two things wrong with this kind of general defense of disciplinarity. First, it essentially just argues that we are in bad legal shape if we cannot defend disciplinary expertise. That's not an argument for such expertise. We may simply be in bad legal shape. We need to defend the core issues that always emerge from disciplinary debates. Is a purported field of knowledge a field of knowledge or not? Is there or is there not anything other than a kind of clubbiness and like-mindedness behind claims that some piece of philosophy or some literary analysis contributes or doesn't to human knowledge? We could settle for who knows, but it conforms to the current standards that define good work. But that could be true of astrology or faith healing too. We need some sort of gold standard defense, not the woe is us if we can't defense, or it's as good as what everybody else does defense. Secondly, as noted in the Foucault example above, disciplines manage to credential expertise and still be subject to revolutionary transformation. Whatever the source of disciplinary authority, it looks to be defensible even in the face of such upheavals. Indeed, it could be argued that it's the mark of the vitality of a discipline as a real discipline of knowledge if it can be subject to such upheavals. We come now to my chief concern, a form of interdisciplinarity that could be more aptly called reductive disciplinarity. This occurs when the argument for importing the methods or practices of one discipline into another is actually an attempt to replace one discipline by another, to argue in effect against the credibility of a discipline's claim to research university status. Now, sometimes this just happens, let us say, naturally, and no such suspect attack and colonizing is going on. Perhaps linguistics just is slowly becoming a subfield of cognitive neuropsychology, and this because of a growing consensus about how we might best study language acquisition and use. What had been philosophy of logic in philosophy is in fact increasingly being done by mathematicians, and not as a result of any campaign by mathematicians. Perhaps the adoption by political scientists of the methodology of microeconomics will mean that it will someday become a subdiscipline in that field, in economics. And this not because some dean wants to fire some secretaries and create mega departments, but because of an evolving consensus that's hard to predict now. But sometimes, I think often today, this reductive strategy in the claims for interdisciplinarity is highly suspect, not finally intellectually credible. Of course, occasionally they are so absurd there's no reason to take them seriously. Stephen Hawking tells us that with the advances in contemporary physics, all of traditional philosophy is over. Philosophy is dead. In such cases, it would be reasonable to wait until there is some evidence that Hawking knows anything about philosophy before we begin closing up shop. But there are plenty of other examples of such reductive disciplinarity that come close to that absurdity, or so it seems to me, but are taken much more seriously. There are two main forms out and about nowadays. For example, a proper understanding of evolutionary biology and brain science will turn out to be all that ethics really amounts to. The best form of literary analysis of character behavior in novels is to apply game theoretic models that explain what they do and why. We will understand what art is and how it means what it does when we understand the neurological model of aesthetic experience. All aesthetics is neuroaesthetics. What we need in art history is not art criticism, the careful exfoliation of a painting's meaning, but Bildwissenschaft, image science, or Bildmedienwissenschaft, picture media science, or even visualistique, visualistics, all sciences of visual processing. Likewise, we will understand traditional problems of epistemology, like the relation between perception and perceptual knowledge, and philosophy of mind, like the problem of intentional content, when the cognitive sciences tell us how all that works. Or the modern mathematics of probability is the best way to understand issues in a theory of knowledge. Of course, one should also note that there have been such reductive campaigns conducted in the humanities and social sciences on behalf of other sorts of sciences, usually from within the discipline, like logical positivism in philosophy, or like semiotics, structuralism, Marxism, Marxist structuralism, Althusser in his heyday, psychoanalysis, and Lacanian psychoanalysis in literary and art studies. These and many like them are often advertised as new and exciting interdisciplinary explorations. They are nothing of the sort. They are reductionist enterprises whose effect would be the elimination of the disciplines they're supposedly enriching. As with the retort above about deep disciplinarity, this is no objection to them. There were chairs of phrenology, the science of reading bumps in the head, and physiognomy, the science of facial typology, in Germany well into the 19th century. Perhaps we are just in a period of revolutionary tumult when what seemed inconceivable must now be conceived. I don't think we are, and I will try to say why. In the course of doing so, I will allow myself one vague and unsupported suggestion about the ideological character of these reductionist projects. I mean the following. What these enterprises are attacking is any claim for the autonomy of the main objects of the traditional human sciences, meaning and value. A traditional justification of such autonomy need not be very complicated. The claims are simply that understanding meaning, the meaning of what someone does or says, the meaning of a poem or a painting or a film or many kinds of text, can be extremely difficult. Needless to say, understanding that the appearance of meaning is only that, an illusion, is even exponentially more difficult, but I will come to that shortly. In order to do this, one needs practice and advice from people who seem to have been able to do it well. It also helps to have some exposure to communities and historical societies who seem to have had very different ways of making themselves understood to each other. When we're trying to figure out whether a friend is betraying a confidence or looking out for us, or what sense it could make to say that someone is self-deceived, we will not be aided by having learned the adaptive fitness of loyalty. Moreover, and in the most complicated register, no one will understand how to mean what she wants to mean without such practice and advice. The central two questions about value are simply what ought I to believe and what, in various circumstances, ought I or we to do. These questions will still be there, waiting for some reasoned resolution or some decision, no matter what we learn about how the brain works when it values some course of action or lends credence to some belief. We cannot wait to see what our brain decides. This all changes under the conditions in the academy we are considering. Meaning just becomes information. Understanding becomes information processing. Values become matter-of-fact preferences of individuals. The realization of value becomes strategic success at the efficient maximization of everyone's preferences, consistent with the maximization of everyone else's. Now for the point about ideology. The success of this disciplinary colonizing would in effect produce a globalized capitalist mass consumer society with exactly what it needs. Let's call it normatively unconstrained consumption, steered by nudge advertising and political messages, surveilled by ubiquitous cameras and computer monitoring, encouraging us as scientifically sanctioned the form of behavior such a society relies on, ruthless competition and endless consumption. Nothing that Marx could have imagined as ideologically distorting our understanding of ourselves and our true needs, all for the benefit of those who most profit from such a manipulated self-understanding. Not art, not religion, not political philosophy could come remotely close to the ideological power and effectiveness of this partnership between scientism and consumer capitalism, all in the guise of the happy celebration of interdisciplinarity in the academy. But I mentioned there was another version of this reductive disciplinarity, and for comprehensiveness we should consider it. It too is a new disciplinarity in the guise of absolute anti-disciplinarity, a reduction by negation, and another attack on the autonomy of meaning and value as objects of study, but also, as if in a kind of conspiracy with scientism, in the name of anti-humanism or anti-subjectivity, structuralist and deconstructive attacks on such objects of study. We've already heard the recitation of its various names since the 60s, but it remains a very difficult subject to discuss economically, especially if one is dissatisfied with the philosophy behind such approaches, as I am. For one thing, conservative critics who clearly have no idea of the scope and power of such things as Heidegger's critique of Western philosophy or the staggering brilliance of Freud, have so dominated this debate that there is little one can say to express the dissatisfactions one has with those enterprises that does not quickly sound like Lynn Cheney or Roger Kimball or, heaven help us, Roger Scruton. But this new reductive disciplinarity inside the humanities also presents itself as the interdisciplinary study of failed meaning wherever it appears, in literature, in philosophy, in art, and it has been just as serious a problem in getting a fair hearing for genuine interdisciplinarity. The stated ambitions of, let's call it, interdisciplinarity as critical theory are, of course, unobjectionable and again have a Kantian origin. The understandable motive is to escape from dogmatism, to escape from the reliance on unchallenged assumptions, from pretensions to authoritative knowledge that cannot be defended, and from whole structures of knowledge, for Kant, for example, rationalist metaphysics and unreflective empiricism, that are to be exposed as mere illusions of knowledge. But Kant engaged in such a critique for the sake of critically well-grounded knowledge, which he called critical philosophy in general and transcendental idealism in particular, and he appreciated the enormity of that revolutionary task. But the movement's roiling humanities department since the 60s have been attacks on the stability and comprehensibility of meaning in the name of the inevitable failure of meaning tout court. They thus create philosophically unacceptable self-referential paradoxes. They present themselves and their approach as privileged perspectives exempt from the destabilizing attention they direct elsewhere, and they have created the impression inside and outside the academy of sophistry, frivolous punning, and banal attempts at irony, and what is worse and genuinely ironic, a kind of arrogation to itself of supreme authority in all fields of meaning and value. There is now to be a new discipline, and its proclamations amount simply to a new dogmatism. From any sort of philosophical point of view, but especially a critical point of view, to claim to know that all the following is the case is an assertion of philosophical wisdom that is stupefying in its self-congratulatory certitude. There is no truth. The belief that we can distinguish true claims from untrue ones is a self-interested lie. There's the paradox again. The assumption that propositions are about objects that are not propositions is indefensible, because we now know that language cannot have a referential function. There are no agents singularly responsible for what they do. We now know that the notion that actions are the results of deliberation and the formation of intentions by singular subjects is a delusion. The imputation of an authorial intelligence behind a text is a sheer fabrication. We know this. Meaning does not guide interpretation, but is created by interpretive acts, which themselves fail to cohere intelligibly when examined. All epistemes are regimes of power and nothing more. We now know this. I'm sure anyone in this room could go on with such a list of discoveries by the new megadiscipline theory. As I said, anyone wandering into this area in a partisan way is bound to start sounding like Roger Scruton. What's wrong with Scruton and Cheney and the like is that they do not concede that at bottom, that is, not in manifestations like secondary literature or in campus politics, but at the deepest philosophical level, the original challenges to the Western tradition by Nietzsche and Heidegger and to the practices of interpreting, reading, and writing bound up with that tradition are profound and disturbing. No serious person with any stake at all in the sciences of meaning and value can afford to go on as if these challenges had not been made. So there's obviously a great deal more to be said about such challenges, but the point I'm trying to make now is just that neither the scientific attempt to colonize the sciences of meaning, nor the critical theory attempts to replace them with a perpetually self-undermining demonstration of always deferred meaning, nor a kind of perpetual Pyrrhonian skepticism about all forms of authority other than its own, are productive ways to deal with the problems of disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity today. The curriculum of the first universities formed in the 11th and 12th century in Europe simply reflected the organization of what was known and considered important at the time. The trivium had priority: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But all the 7 liberal arts were taught, those 3, plus arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music theory. Soon thereafter, the Aristotelian branches of philosophy, physics, metaphysics, and moral philosophy were added. There was no more deep rationale for this structure than there is in universities today. Animal husbandry and criminal science can be taught along with courses on 12th century Baghdad, the early work of Jean-Paul Sartre, and hip-hop music. Nothing about this is surprising or alarming. For one thing, the tertiary educational system in the United States cannot be compared with Europe's or anyone else's. It's extraordinarily variegated. There are well over 4,000 institutions of higher learning in the United States, more than 18 million students, and 1 million faculty members. There are about 1,200 community colleges in this number, and they enroll the highest number of these students. We also need to remember that most students in American colleges and universities concentrate their major in, business programs. In most of this system, there are no disciplinary problems. But universities, especially the so-called elite and so world historically expensive private research universities and exclusive liberal arts colleges, have to stand for something, must propose an ideal of the well-educated person. The major site of a crisis in this attempt, I've been suggesting, lies in how universities propose to organize studies of meaning and value, enterprises which do not lend themselves to machine-graded multiple choice tests, or MOOC courses, and which offer no clear criteria for when a person might have become a better reader, interpreter, hermeneut, or reflective evaluator. We can't produce results showing how we got from A to B and made somebody a better interpreter of the complexities of human life. All this becomes even more complicated when universities began to study and require study of vernacular literature, contemporary philosophers, and paintings. More complicated still when post-60s the study of popular culture was added, along with familiarization courses designed to introduce a multicultural appreciation of other civilizations and traditions. Given that, by comparison with the natural and much of the social sciences, the humanities and the interpretive social sciences cannot test improvements in the understanding of such things cleanly, let us say. That the arrival of a $40,000 a year tuition bill might well turn this feature into a contested and difficult problem, especially when John or Jane gets a C in 18th century painting, complicating his or her chances for dental school. Faculties might lose confidence under this pressure in their ability to respond to such concerns, and so be susceptible to, might even want to embrace, the two forms of phony interdisciplinarity I've been discussing. This is what I think has happened. One might also be tempted to say these faculty are tempted to wildly inflate grades as a way of making the source of the problem go away, but that's a different and very delicate topic. Grades in the United States in colleges have gone through the roof. They're much, much higher than they were 25 or 30 years ago, and I'm suggesting part of the reason for that is this kind of pressure. If you're getting $45,000 a year from a student and they have to take a course in 18th century painting and they get a C, and it does ruin their chances for dental school, as a parent you might be a little upset. You might want to know, what's a B if this is a C? Better yet, what's an A? And it's become more and more the case frequently. Parents of college students never used to call you up. Never happened. Never hear from them. You do now. Does this mean I'm encouraging a return to traditional disciplinarity or even deep disciplinarity? Not at all. I agree that the disciplinary boundaries as they are currently drawn can be pretty arbitrary and in many cases can be stifling rather than liberating. But realizing this and so being open to non-traditional ways of organizing research of research and of thinking about something, must always be careful about the greatest current danger to a thriving atmosphere of interdisciplinarity, the temptation to reductive disciplinarity. Genuine interdisciplinarity, I would suggest, is best thought of as always ad hoc, never formulatable programmatically. There must be programmatic structures that allow for it, and that can even grant degrees in it, and so grant it academic credibility. There must be programs that make available advice and an evaluation by faculty who have some experience in what is required for doing genuine interdisciplinary research well. And any genuine interdisciplinarity must be based on deep disciplinary training. All that means is that one had better know what one is talking about, have studied an issue in some depth in a concentrated way, in ways that a discipline teaches. And nothing should be off the table, even given my suspicions above. If someone thinks that a game theoretic analysis can help us understand what's going on with the characters in Pride and Prejudice, all the better, let them try. Typically in the example in a famous story run by the New York Times about a UCLA political science professor who did just that, the result is this. When Lady Catherine de Bourgh tries to get Elizabeth to promise not to marry Mr. Darcy and she refuses, then Lady de Bourgh reports this to Darcy. He thereby learns that she's still interested, and so it helps Elizabeth's plans. Elizabeth has succeeded in thinking strategically. That is, the result is something any 8th grade boy or girl with half a working brain can see without learning anything about von Neumann. And there will be times when the study of a complex problem is not suited even for interdisciplinary approaches, when the form of the question asked is so novel that it cannot be asked inside of or in any traditional combination of traditional disciplines. The project would then be genuinely transdisciplinary, and universities have to be ready for that. Actually, I think in terms of the people I work on, I think of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as transdisciplinary in this way, defining a new object of study, a kind of collective human-mindedness he called Geist or spirit, and a new way of studying it that neither relies on what philosophy had been, nor founds anything remotely like a new discipline of phenomenology. Nietzsche's treatment of Greek tragedy in The Birth of Tragedy is also transdisciplinary in this sense. It all at once redefines what classical philology might be rather than extends that discipline, and it does the same for philosophy and even, in that essay, for music criticism. In our time, the Harvard philosopher Stanley Cavell's work on film, Contesting Tears, the Hollywood melodrama of the unknown woman, and Pursuits of Happiness, the Hollywood comedy of remarriage, are not examples of either film criticism or philosophy or an interdisciplinary combination of both. His project, in effect, redefines how films mean what they mean, and in making clear what philosophy misses by not attending to what is missed, he changes what we think philosophy is or might be. It is transdisciplinary work. When my colleague in the committee, Jonathan Lear, is inspired by issues in Kierkegaard and Heidegger, began to consider what is involved when an entire form of life could be said to die or go dead, and hit upon the idea of thinking through that issue by thinking about what happened to the Crow Nation in the late 19th century and how they talked about it, he produced the wonderful book, Radical Hope, a book that is not ethnography or anthropology or history or psychoanalysis or philosophy, but transcends them while being well-informed by them all. And this because the problem itself demanded such a unique approach. Likewise with the art history and art criticism of Michael Fried, Johns Hopkins. It fits no disciplinary model of art history or art criticism, invokes literature and philosophy to illuminate the event of meaning happening in a painting by Manet or a sculpture by Caro or a photograph by Jeff Wall, in ways in which literature and philosophy have never been invoked. And all of this, because of its compellingness, redefines the discipline, or should redefine the discipline of art history, shines a different sort of light on what philosophy might be, on what the significance of literature might consist in, although again, he does not establish a new discipline of Freudian art history. His approach is an inspiration, not a method. My own meager attempts in this regard have had to do with the bearing of literature, painting, and especially film on philosophy. I've proposed that we consider commercially produced films as artworks, to be concerned with a modality of collective self-knowledge in historical time, a modality that is both distinct and indispensable. What is distinctive about such a modality is quite complicated as the distinctive logical properties of self-knowledge itself, much less collective self-knowledge. But the form of collectively expressed self-knowledge at issue in film is not propositional or even discursive. It seems closer to the pictorial intelligibility available whenever we understand whatever is appropriate to understand when beholding Raphael's Sistine Madonna or Manet's Olympia. Whatever mistake we make when we understand the Raphael as a great picture of what Mary must have looked like, or when we complain about the Olympia that she looks like a cutout pasted onto the canvas, it's the same order of mistake we make when we understand John Ford's films to be about how cowboys treated Indians. Moreover, the self-knowledge is not otherwise available, formulatable in propositions, and then merely represented or expressed in a sensible medium. It's realized in film, made available to us at what it is through the medium and unavailable in any other way. Films should not be understood as they regularly are when they're used in classrooms, another example of false interdisciplinarity, as illustrations of philosophical points or as pedagogical aids to interest students or to explain things to them. They are ways of rendering matters intelligible that can be rendered intelligible in no other way. Just a few brief closing remarks and then I'm done. Universities tend to resist, to say the least, programs that allow for something rather than require something. They resist the programmatic, unprogrammatic, and they want everything to fit some model. We've certainly been subject to this at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. This is a description of the committee provided by my colleague in anthropology, the anthropologist Marshall Salins. It's apt, quote, "Our famous Committee on Social Thought has neither paradigm nor object. but nonetheless flourishes blamelessly on the Cartesian principle that mere thinking is a sufficient title to existence." Unquote. It's easier to run an institution with standard departments rather than have to account for something that answers this description. And traditional disciplines tend to regard the very existence of a non-disciplinary program as some sort of indictment of it, certainly as a revenue drainer, revenue that could go to it. I am, of course, not suggesting that such institutions can be justified only if every dissertation written in the Committee on Social Thought or the Institute of Liberal Arts or at the Humanities Center at Hopkins or in the History of Consciousness program at Santa Cruz is likely to be another Nietzsche or Hegel in its transdisciplinary uniqueness, or another interdisciplinary innovation on the order of Habermas or Bernard Williams' book Shame and Necessity. But the permission to innovate, institutionally sanctioned and funded, is vitally important to both disciplinary innovation and to the end of knowledge and understanding for its own sake. This requires a certain collection of faculty, of course, and one should never underestimate the hesitation many faculty feel at qualifying their disciplinary affiliation, much less leaving it altogether. But it especially requires administrators who care about knowledge and understanding for its own sake and who possess one other trait. They have to trust their own faculty to operate with integrity and prudence in a non-disciplinary program. This may seem so obvious as not to merit attention, but trust is a vital civic as well as academic virtue, and an atmosphere of financial panic with the suspicions about unfair resource distribution or waste or vulnerability that it creates is profoundly hostile to trust. It is not likely that if this panic lasts much longer, non-traditional forms of study and research will survive such an atmosphere. My point today has been to argue that if that happens and they do not survive, something extremely important will be lost, something that ought to be vital to any true university's sense of itself and of its worth. Thank you very much for your patience.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.